The summer air clung heavy over downtown Raleigh, North Carolina. The late afternoon sun shimmered off the glass windows of the high-rise office buildings, casting streaks of light across the concrete sidewalks. The streets were alive with the hum of traffic and the shuffle of pedestrians, but one corner was about to become the epicenter of a confrontation no one expected. Derek Coleman, 52 years old, stood in front of the Capitol Plaza complex. He wasn't wearing a robe or carrying the air of authority most would expect from a man of his stature. Instead, he was dressed plainly, dark slacks, a tucked-in gray polo, and a neatly trimmed beard that had started to gray around the edges. To the crowd, he looked like just another middle-aged black man working security. His ID badge hung from his belt, clipped near the set of keys that jingled faintly when he shifted his weight. Officer Scott Miller, a patrol cop with a reputation around town for being cocky, pulled up in his cruiser to the curb. He had received a loitering call from a nearby cafe manager who noticed Derek standing by the main entrance for longer than expected. Miller stepped out of his car with a swagger, his sunglasses catching the glint of the sun, and already wore that half-smirk that suggested he'd made up his mind before asking a single question. "Hey, you," Miller barked, adjusting his belt as he approached. "What exactly are you doing here?" Derek raised his head slowly, his expression calm but sharp. "I work here." His tone was even, polite but firm, the kind of voice that belonged to a man used to commanding respect without raising it. Miller scoffed, glancing Derek up and down as if the very idea was laughable. "You work here? Right, and I'm the governor." A couple of passers-by slowed, their curiosity piqued by the rising tension. Derek kept his composure, his hands folded in front of him, not wanting to give the officer the slightest excuse to escalate. "I'm telling you," Derek said, steady and unwavering, "I belong here. My office is inside." But Miller only laughed, loud, derisive, and deliberate. He looked Derek dead in the eye, tilted his head back, and chuckled as if the words were the funniest thing he'd heard all day. "Inside? Come on, man. Don't try to play that card. You're just the security guard, right? Standing out here trying to look important. Let's not pretend otherwise." The smirk widened across his face. His voice carried across the plaza, his laugh echoing off the marble pillars of the courthouse building. People turned. Some raised phones, ready to capture what was happening. Derek didn't flinch. His jaw tightened slightly, but he stood straight, tall, every inch of his posture radiating dignity. He could have snapped back, revealed who he really was, but he didn't. Not yet. "I've given you my answer," Derek said quietly, his eyes locking with Miller's. That should be enough. But Miller wasn't backing down. "Answer? You haven't given me anything. You think you can just stand around in front of a courthouse like you own the place?" His tone sharpened. "Show me your ID, now." The crowd thickened. A woman whispered, "He didn't do anything." Another man muttered under his breath, "Here we go again." Derek reached slowly for his wallet, calm and deliberate, each movement measured. He wasn't afraid, but he knew better than anyone how quickly things could spiral. He pulled out his state-issued ID, the one that held his full name and title. He extended it, waiting, but Officer Miller didn't even glance at the ID before waving it off dismissively. "Don't bother flashing fake badges at me. I've seen guys like you plenty of times. Always got some story, always got an excuse." He leaned in close enough that his laugh cut like a blade. "Security guard, that's all you are. Don't dress it up." The sting of those words hung heavy in the air. A few people gasped. Someone in the back whispered, "Does he even know who that is?" But Miller wasn't listening. His hand rested near his holster, not drawn, but ready, his body language broadcasting both arrogance and threat. He straightened up, puffing his chest out like he owned the block. "Tell you what, buddy. Since you think you're so important, why don't you step aside while I check this area? Don't interfere or you'll regret it." For a moment, time seemed suspended. The breeze stilled, the onlookers hushed, and Derek's silence felt louder than any words could. He tucked his ID back into his wallet and slid it calmly into his pocket. His eyes never left Miller's. "Officer," he said finally, his voice low, deliberate, and cutting through the thick tension like steel. "You may want to rethink how you're handling this." Miller barked out another laugh. "What, you threatening me now, is that it? A security guard threatening a cop? That's rich." And then, before Derek could reply, the courthouse doors swung open. Judge Alan Whitaker himself stepped out, his robe flowing behind him, his silver hair catching the sunlight. His eyes landed on the scene, narrowing instantly as he recognized the man Officer Miller had just mocked in front of half the city. The plaza fell utterly silent. Every spectator felt it, that shift, that unraveling of Miller's smug confidence as realization crept closer with every heartbeat. Because Derek Coleman wasn't a security guard, he wasn't a loiterer, he wasn't some random man standing on the steps. He was a sitting judge on the State Court of Appeals, and Officer Scott Miller had just laughed in his face. The hush that swept over the courthouse steps was like a curtain dropping. People who had been murmuring, pointing, or quietly filming with their phones now stood frozen in place, unsure if they were about to witness humiliation or revelation. Judge Alan Whitaker strode down the marble stairs with the measured pace of a man who had commanded respect in courtrooms for decades. His eyes locked on Derek Coleman and then shifted briefly to Officer Scott Miller. The recognition in Whitaker's expression was instant, but so was the judgment. "Mr. Coleman," Whitaker said, his tone carrying across the plaza with crisp authority, "is everything all right here?" The crowd stiffened. The weight of that name, Coleman, carried with it more than just familiarity. Some recognized it immediately. Others pieced it together in whispers. Derek Coleman wasn't just anyone. He was a jurist whose written opinions shaped laws across the state. Derek turned slowly, nodding respectfully to the judge. His composure never wavered. "Everything is fine, Your Honor," he said evenly, though the air around him told a different story. Officer Miller was curious about my presence. The words were measured, diplomatic, almost too careful, but they cut deep. Miller blinked, confusion flashing across his face. He glanced between Derek and Judge Whitaker, trying to recalibrate. "Wait, Your Honor," he stammered. Then, turning back to Derek with disbelief, "You're not serious. You're telling me this guy—" He jabbed a thumb toward Derek, his laugh breaking through again like a shield against reality. "He's no judge. Look at him." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered, "He doesn't know." Another whispered, "He's digging his own grave." Whitaker's expression hardened. "Officer Miller," he said, voice edged with steel, "perhaps you should take a closer look before making assumptions. Mr. Coleman is not only licensed security in this building, he is one of the sitting judges of the State Court of Appeals. His chambers are on the 12th floor. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the hum of traffic seemed to fade. Miller's smirk faltered, then twisted into an awkward half-laugh, as if clinging desperately to arrogance could save him. "You're telling me," Miller said, shaking his head with forced amusement, "this guy, this man I just caught loitering, is a judge? That's a good one. Real funny. You almost had me there." But no one else was laughing. Phones were raised higher now, cameras zooming in to catch every flicker of Miller's unraveling confidence. Derek remained silent, letting the weight of truth hang in the air. He didn't need to defend himself. The facts, spoken by Whitaker, carried more force than any protest. Whitaker stepped forward, his presence looming. "Officer Miller," he said in a voice that silenced even the restless shuffling in the crowd, "you just openly mocked and dismissed a sitting appellate judge in public while he was standing outside his own courthouse." His words cut sharper than any gavel strike. "Are you proud of that conduct?" Miller's throat bobbed as he swallowed, his earlier bravado wilting under the judge's glare. I was just doing my job, sir," he stammered, making sure nobody suspicious was hanging around. "Suspicious?" someone in the crowd barked out, unable to hold it back. "He works here. He's one of the highest judges in the state." The wave of indignation spread. The murmurs grew into a low rumble of outrage, and Miller, suddenly realizing the tide had turned, shifted uneasily on his feet. But Derek Coleman remained steady, his voice calm when he finally spoke again. "You laughed at me, officer," he said, low enough that silence fell to catch it. "Not because I did anything wrong, but because of what you assumed I was. That's not suspicion, that's bias. And in my courtroom, bias has consequences." Miller flinched, his eyes darting from Derek to Whitaker, to the crowd that was no longer on his side. His laughter was gone now, replaced by the uneasy tightness of a man who felt the ground slipping beneath him. Whitaker folded his arms across his chest. "Officer Miller," he said coldly, "consider this conversation far from over. You may want to prepare for inquiries beyond what happens on these courthouse steps." The crowd buzzed, every word feeding the storm building around the officer, and Derek, still calm, still rooted like an oak in the heat of the moment, turned and began walking toward the courthouse doors. His measured steps carried the quiet thunder of a man who knew exactly who he was and exactly how badly he had been underestimated. The story that unfolded on those courthouse steps didn't begin with the smirk of Officer Scott Miller or the quiet resolve of Derek Coleman. It began decades earlier in a very different corner of North Carolina. Derek grew up in Greensboro, in a working-class neighborhood where sidewalks cracked under the weight of years and porches leaned with quiet defiance against storms. His parents, Samuel and Lorraine Coleman, raised him with little more than grit, discipline, and an unshakable belief in the value of education. Samuel worked long shifts at a textile mill, his hands perpetually stained with the residue of machinery grease, while Lorraine taught part-time at a local elementary school, instilling in Derek a love for books that would eventually shape his destiny. From a young age, Derek saw both sides of the law. He watched neighbors harassed for minor infractions and friends pushed into the justice system by circumstance rather than choice. He also saw his mother sit across the kitchen table from those same young men, helping them write essays or study for a GED exam, insisting that failure didn't have to be permanent. Those two forces, the harsh reality of the streets and the unwavering push for opportunity, formed the bedrock of Derek's worldview. By the time he graduated high school, Derek's mind was already set. Law wasn't just a career path, it was a calling. He enrolled at Howard University, where he majored in political science before moving on to law school at the University of North Carolina. While others chased prestige in corporate firms, Derek sought internships with public defenders and civil rights organizations. He spent late nights poring over cases, drawn not to the easy victories but to the uphill battles, the ones where the odds stacked against his clients mirrored the odds he'd seen his community face every day. His rise through the legal ranks was steady, built not on shortcuts but on persistence. Derek began as a county prosecutor, then transitioned into private practice where he earned a reputation for dismantling flimsy evidence and exposing weak testimony. He became known as the attorney who stayed calm when others cracked under pressure, who never raised his voice yet always commanded the room. Judges noticed. So did his peers. By his mid-40s, Derek had been appointed to the state bench. 5 years later, he took his seat on the North Carolina Court of Appeals. His opinions carried weight far beyond his courtroom, meticulous, balanced, and written with a clarity that revealed both intellect and empathy. Lawyers cited his rulings in other states. Professors used them as teaching tools. To some, he was simply Judge Coleman. To others, he was the embodiment of what justice should look like when stripped of politics and prejudice. Yet, despite the robe, the chambers, and the authority, Derek never forgot the sidewalks where he started. He often walked through the plaza without escorts, without the trappings of office, blending with ordinary citizens. He believed a judge should never be so far removed from the people that he no longer understood them. But that humility came with a cost. It made him invisible to men like Scott Miller, men who measured worth by appearance, who saw uniformed authority as absolute and dismissed quiet dignity as weakness. Miller didn't see the man who had presided over landmark cases or who had penned decisions that rippled through the legal system. He saw only what he wanted to see: a middle-aged black man standing on courthouse steps, easily reduced to a punchline. And that blind assumption, rooted not in fact but in prejudice, was why the confrontation outside the plaza struck deeper than an ordinary misunderstanding. Because Derek Coleman wasn't just any man. He was a judge who carried within him the history of a community, the weight of a system he'd spent a lifetime trying to make more just. His very presence defied the stereotype Miller tried to trap him in. And now, with the eyes of the city upon them, that truth was about to burst into the open. The plaza outside the courthouse had become something more than just a sidewalk filled with bystanders. It was now a stage, and every person present was an audience member waiting to see which way the story would turn. Officer Scott Miller stood stiffly, his jaw clenched, as the weight of Judge Whitaker's words sank in. The murmurs in the crowd had grown into a steady hum of disbelief. People weren't just watching anymore, they were documenting, live streaming, and spreading the incident across social media with captions that carried both outrage and awe. "Can you believe this?" a young woman whispered, phone in hand. "That's Judge Coleman. I've read about him in the papers." "No way," another muttered, zooming in with his camera. "That cop just laughed in his face. He's done." Miller shifted, trying to regain footing. "Listen," he said loudly, attempting to project authority. "I was only doing my job. Anybody standing around a courthouse is suspicious. I didn't know who he was, but the excuse faltered under the glares around him." Judge Whitaker didn't flinch. "Officer Miller," he said with sharp precision, "you weren't doing your job. You were exercising judgment clouded by arrogance, and now the entire city is watching." Miller swallowed hard. The same laugh that once carried confidence now threatened to choke him. He turned toward Derek, his voice edged with forced calm. "Look, maybe I came off rough, but you can't deny you looked out of place. No badge, no robe, just standing there like what?" Derek's voice cut in, even and deliberate. He didn't raise it, but the silence that fell made it ring louder than a shout. His eyes locked on Miller's. "Say it plainly, officer. Like a black man who didn't belong." The crowd stirred. Gasps spread like wildfire. Miller froze, his words collapsing in his throat. The accusation wasn't said in anger, but in truth, and truth, spoken with calm clarity, could crush louder voices. Judge Whitaker stepped closer, his presence commanding. "I suggest you stop speaking, officer. Every word you utter digs you deeper." At that moment, courthouse staff emerged through the glass doors, clerks, bailiffs, and attorneys who recognized Derek instantly. Their faces showed the shock of realization. A bailiff hurried down the steps, nodding respectfully. "Judge Coleman, do you need assistance?" The title rolled out across the crowd like thunder. Judge Coleman. The whispers turned into a roar, phones lifted higher, and Officer Miller's face drained of its remaining confidence. Derek remained still, his composure unbroken. "No," he answered calmly. "I don't need assistance, but the system does." Those words landed heavy. They weren't just directed at Miller, they were aimed at everyone watching, at every person who had seen bias overlooked and arrogance excused. It wasn't just one man being judged, it was a culture. News vans screeched to a stop at the edge of the block. Local reporters spilled out, cameras rolling, voices hurried into microphones. The story was spreading faster than anyone could contain it. Miller took a half step back, suddenly aware of the sheer scale of his mistake. His smirk was gone. His laugh had evaporated. In its place was the haunted look of a man realizing that the uniform he wore no longer shielded him. Judge Whitaker spoke again, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Officer Miller, you will file a full report of this incident by end of day, and I can assure you, this will not end with paperwork. There will be a review." Miller opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His authority, once inflated by arrogance, was stripped bare in front of everyone. And Derek? He didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. He simply turned, straightened his shoulders, and walked back through the courthouse doors with quiet dignity. Every step was a reminder, to the crowd, to the cameras, and to Miller, that respect cannot be demanded through laughter or arrogance. It is earned, and it cannot be erased by prejudice. The plaza buzzed louder now. People debated what they had just seen. Reporters scrambled to broadcast the footage, and courthouse officials whispered among themselves. But one truth lingered heavier than the rest. Officer Scott Miller hadn't just laughed at a man, he had laughed at a judge, and in doing so, he had set into motion a storm that was only beginning to gather. The heavy wooden doors closed behind Derek Coleman with a soft thud, shutting out the chaos of the plaza. Inside, the marble hallways of the State Court of Appeals carried a quieter kind of weight. Echoes of footsteps, murmured conversations, and the faint smell of polished oak. Yet even here, whispers of what had just happened outside were already spreading like wildfire. Clerks peered over stacks of files, their eyes following Derek as he passed. Law clerks nudged one another, whispering, "Did you see? It's already online. They're saying Officer Miller mocked him on camera." Derek moved with his usual calm, though every step felt heavier. He wasn't angry, not in the explosive sense, but there was a solemn gravity to his silence. He knew better than anyone what came next. Incidents like this didn't stay contained. They multiplied, spread, and turned into symbols far larger than the moment itself. As he reached his chambers on the 12th floor, his secretary, Monique Brown, stood waiting. A sharp, poised woman in her 40s, Monique had worked with Derek for years. She didn't speak at first. She simply studied his face, searching for cracks in his composure. Finally, she said softly, "It's everywhere already. Reporters are calling. The chief judge's office left a message." Derek set his briefcase down on the desk. He exhaled slowly, then turned toward the window, looking out across the city skyline. The sun was beginning to dip, the golden light casting long shadows over Raleigh. "I expected as much," he replied, his tone steady. "An officer mocks a judge on the courthouse steps. That was never going to stay quiet." Monique's brow furrowed. "Do you want me to draft a statement?" He shook his head. "No statements, not yet. This isn't about my pride. It's about principle. If I speak too soon, it becomes personal. If I wait, it becomes institutional." Those words carried weight. Derek understood the battlefield he was walking into. It wasn't a courtroom where evidence ruled, nor a press room where spin dominated. It was the court of public opinion, where truth could be drowned in noise unless handled with precision. A knock came at the door. Emily Clark, a fellow judge and longtime colleague, stepped in. Her expression was tight, concern etched across her face. "Derek," she said, "I just saw the footage. Half the bench has. What happened out there?" Derek turned slowly. "Exactly what you saw. An officer laughed at me, dismissed me as if I were no more than a loiterer, as if my presence on these steps needed his permission." Emily sighed, shaking her head. "This city is about to tear itself apart over this. You realize that, don't you? The symbolism, a cop mocking an appellate judge in front of the courthouse?" "I realize," Derek said, his voice even, "and that's why we need to handle it carefully. This can't just be about one officer's arrogance. It has to be about the culture that made him think it was acceptable." Emily leaned against the desk. "The chief judge is already calling an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. They'll want you there. And Derek—" She hesitated. "There are already calls for an internal investigation. Some are saying Miller could face suspension." Derek's gaze hardened. "Suspension isn't enough. If we let this slide as bad optics, we miss the larger issue. This was bias on full display, and bias in uniform is a threat to justice itself." Monique glanced between them, sensing the storm gathering. "So what's the plan?" Derek turned back toward the window, his silhouette framed against the fading light. "The plan," he said slowly, is to let the truth do what it always does, rise. But not just for me. For everyone who's been laughed at, dismissed, or silenced for looking like they didn't belong. That officer picked the wrong man to underestimate, and tomorrow the state will know it. Silence hung heavy in the room. Outside, sirens wailed faintly in the distance, a reminder that the city's heartbeat never stopped. But inside Judge Coleman's chambers, the fight was just beginning. The following morning, the atmosphere inside the North Carolina Court of Appeals was unlike anything the building had experienced in years. The stately halls, usually humming with quiet deliberation, buzzed with tension. Clerks whispered in corners, bailiffs exchanged guarded looks, and reporters camped outside the entrance, their cameras trained on the steps like vultures circling for the first sign of movement. At precisely 9 a.m., Derek Coleman walked into the conference chamber where the panel of senior judges convened. His steps were steady, his expression composed, but the weight of the previous day lingered. He wasn't just walking into a meeting, he was stepping into the eye of a storm. Chief Judge Alan Whitaker presided at the head of the long mahogany table, his gavel resting beside a neat stack of papers. His silver hair caught the overhead lights, and though his demeanor was calm, the set of his jaw betrayed his anger. "Judge Coleman," Whitaker said firmly, gesturing for Derek to sit, "thank you for joining us. We need to address what happened yesterday. The footage has gone statewide. The governor's office has already called. This is no longer just a courthouse matter, it's a state issue." Around the table sat Judges Emily Clark, Harold Boone, and Maria Sanchez, each with their own reputations for sharp intellect and unshakable principle. Yet this morning, even they seemed unsettled. Judge Sanchez leaned forward, her voice measured. "I watched the footage 3 times last night. Officer Miller's conduct was not just disrespectful, it was openly demeaning. To laugh in your face, dismiss you as a security guard in front of your own courthouse. This strikes at the heart of judicial independence." Judge Boone adjusted his glasses, and the racial undertone was clear. He saw a black man on the courthouse steps and made an assumption. If he does that to a judge, what does he do to an ordinary citizen? The room fell quiet for a moment. Derek folded his hands on the table, his voice calm when he finally spoke. "That's the point. Yesterday wasn't about me. It was about the lens through which too many officers view black men, whether they're standing on a street corner or walking into their own chambers." Whitaker nodded gravely. "The footage has already sparked public outrage. The police department issued a preliminary statement overnight, claiming Officer Miller was ensuring courthouse security. They haven't acknowledged his mockery nor the crowd's reaction." Emily Clark scoffed. "Security? Laughing in a judge's face is security? That explanation won't hold water." Derek remained still, his voice even. "It won't. But they'll cling to it as long as they can. That's why this can't just be about punishment. It has to be about accountability, systemic accountability." Whitaker drummed his fingers on the table, his tone decisive. "Here's what we'll do. First, we'll draft a formal statement from the judiciary condemning Miller's conduct. Second, we'll recommend a full investigation into his behavior, not just yesterday, but his record. If there are patterns, they'll come to light." Judge Sanchez added, "And we should request that the police department release all body camera footage from Miller's past year of service. If they refuse, that refusal will speak volumes." There were nods around the table. The plan was taking shape, but Derek's gaze remained fixed on the polished wood surface before him, his thoughts deeper than policy. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but commanding. "I don't want this to become a story about a judge's pride. That makes it small. This is not about my ego. This is about a man in uniform who laughed at the very notion of my presence. That arrogance threatens not only the dignity of this court, but the trust of every citizen who looks to us for justice." Whitaker leaned back, studying him. "You understand this will make you the face of this battle. Are you ready for that?" Derek met his eyes without hesitation. "I've been ready my entire life." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was the silence of a collective decision settling into place. Whitaker tapped the gavel softly on the table. Then it's decided. We will not let this incident pass quietly. Officer Miller thought his laughter could diminish you. Instead, it may have sparked the reckoning our state has avoided for too long. The judges exchanged glances, the gravity of the moment clear. The meeting adjourned, but the fight was only beginning. Outside those doors, reporters waited. Inside the city, tensions brewed. And within the police department, whispers of panic had already begun to circulate. Officer Scott Miller had mocked a judge on the courthouse steps. And now, the full weight of the judiciary was turning its gaze upon him. While the Court of Appeals chamber bristled with determination, a very different mood gripped the Raleigh Police Department headquarters that same morning. Inside a cramped conference room lined with bulletin boards and faded commendations, Officer Scott Miller sat stiffly at one end of the table, his uniform collar pulled tight against his neck. Across from him sat Captain Brett Collins, his direct supervisor, and two internal affairs investigators with folders stacked high in front of them. The tension was thick enough to choke. "Officer Miller," Captain Collins began, his voice clipped, "do you understand the magnitude of what you've done?" Miller shifted in his chair, forcing a shrug. "I was responding to a suspicious person complaint. I treated him like anyone else. How was I supposed to know he was a judge?" One of the investigators, a stern-faced woman named Latoya Harris, leaned forward. Her voice was calm, but her eyes cut sharp. "It wasn't that you didn't know. It was how you responded. The laughter, the mockery, those were choices, not protocol." Miller flushed, his hands tightening into fists against the table. "He looked like every other guy we get calls about loitering near buildings downtown. I asked questions. He gave me attitude. I laughed. That's it. People are blowing this way out of proportion." Captain Collins' palms slammed the table. The sound ricocheted through the room. "Out of proportion? That guy you mocked is Judge Derek Coleman, State Court of Appeals. His name is on half the legal precedents you were trained to enforce. Do you understand what kind of storm you've dropped on this department?" Miller's mouth opened, but the words faltered. His arrogance was still there, but it no longer carried the shield of certainty. Latoya Harris slid a folder across the table. "We pulled your body cam reports from the past 6 months. There are multiple complaints of you dismissing citizens, using unnecessary force, and mocking individuals during stops. Most were marked unsubstantiated. But now, every single one is going to be re-examined." Miller's face paled. "You can't pin all that on me. Everyone gets complaints." Harris's voice stayed steady. "Yes, but not everyone ends up caught on half a dozen cell phones mocking an appellate judge on the courthouse steps." The words landed heavy. Miller leaned back, the bravado slipping. He muttered almost to himself, I didn't think it mattered." Collins's voice dropped, low and cutting. "That's the problem, Miller. You didn't think. And now it's not just you under the microscope, it's all of us. The mayor's office is calling. The chief's office is scrambling. Do you realize what happens when a cop humiliates a judge on camera? The entire justice system looks like it's at war with itself." Silence followed. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the only sound in the room. Finally, Harris closed the folder and stood. "We'll continue this in formal review. Officer Miller, you are relieved of public duty effective immediately. Your badge and weapons stay with us until further notice." Miller's eyes widened. "You're suspending me for this?" "No," Harris corrected coldly. "We're protecting the department until we know how deep this goes. You mocked the wrong man, officer, and now every decision you've made is about to be dragged into the light." Collins motioned toward the door. "Get out of this room before you make it worse for yourself." Miller stood slowly, his movements jerky, his face pale beneath the harsh lights. As he stepped out into the hallway, officers who once nodded at him looked away. Some whispered, some smirked. The shield of brotherhood was cracking. By the time he reached the parking lot, his phone was buzzing nonstop. Texts, missed calls, voicemails, headlines were already flashing across every local news outlet. Officer suspended after mocking appeals, judge outside courthouse. Miller stared at the screen, his smirk long gone. For the first time in his career, he felt the ground beneath him give way, and he knew he was falling. The day after Officer Scott Miller laughed in the face of Judge Derek Coleman, Raleigh woke up to a different city. The morning news didn't begin with weather updates or traffic reports. It began with grainy phone footage replayed from every angle. Miller's smirk, his mocking tone, Derek's calm responses, Judge Whitaker's thunderous revelation. The video looped again and again, punctuated by anchors' shocked voices. That man you just saw being dismissed is no ordinary citizen. He is a sitting judge on the North Carolina Court of Appeals. It spread faster than wildfire. Within hours, every major outlet from Charlotte to Chicago was carrying the story. Talk radio exploded. Twitter feeds and Facebook timelines filled with reposts, captions written in anger and disbelief. On Instagram, the clip was overlaid with text in bold red letters. "This is what bias looks like." TikTok creators stitched the footage, cutting Miller's laughter against Coleman's unflinching composure, turning humiliation into defiance. By late morning, hashtags surged to the top of national trends. Waju, Judge Coleman, or bias in blue, white respect the court. Lawyers weighed in, professors wrote quick op-eds, and ordinary citizens shared their own stories under the same banner. "If it can happen to him, it can happen to anyone," one woman tweeted. "I was laughed at by an officer when I told him I was a nurse. I thought it was just me. Now I see it's bigger." Downtown Raleigh transformed before noon. What began as a handful of citizens holding hand-drawn signs outside the courthouse grew into hundreds, then thousands. By the afternoon, chants thundered through the concrete canyon of Fayetteville Street. "Whose court? Our court. Whose law? Our law. Bias in blue won't do." Students from local universities arrived in groups, carrying banners painted hastily in dorm lounges. Retirees who had lived through earlier civil rights battles returned to the sidewalks, standing shoulder to shoulder with young protesters. Clergy carried crosses and hymn books. Lawyers marched in their suits, briefcases in hand. Even off-duty officers, quietly, cautiously, stood in the crowd, not shouting but present, signaling that not every badge supported arrogance. Television crews panned over the crowd, their lenses capturing a city that was no longer content with quiet outrage. Raleigh's Courthouse Plaza had become the epicenter of a movement, the chants carrying across blocks, echoing off glass towers, spilling into the state capitol lawn. Local radio opened its lines and the calls poured in. "I'm a black father of 3, one man said, his voice tight with fury. "Last week, my son was pulled over. He told the officer he was a college student. The officer laughed in his face, told him he was probably lying. My boy came home humiliated. Now I see this, and I realize it doesn't matter if you're a student or a judge. If they can laugh at him, they can laugh at anyone." A retired police officer called in next. His tone carried both sorrow and shame. "I wore that badge for 30 years. I told rookies the same thing my captain told me. Respect buys cooperation. What I saw in that video wasn't respect. It wasn't policing. It was mockery. And it disgraces everyone who tries to wear that uniform with honor." A young woman, voice trembling, said, "I watched the video 10 times. I couldn't stop because I saw myself in Judge Coleman. I've been brushed off like that my whole life. To see it happen to someone so powerful made me realize how much worse it is for the rest of us." Every call, every story poured gasoline on the fire. This wasn't just a scandal. It was a mirror reflecting the daily indignities thousands had carried quietly. National networks descended on Raleigh. CNN broadcast from the courthouse steps, the anchor's hair whipped by the summer wind as she spoke into the camera. What began as a routine encounter has now erupted into one of the most high-profile cases of alleged police bias in recent memory. Citizens here call it the Coleman moment. Op-eds filled newspapers coast to coast. Some focused on the racial undertones. Others emphasized the constitutional crisis. What happens when law enforcement disrespects the judiciary itself? Legal scholars debated whether Miller's conduct could rise to contempt, though most agreed the punishment was already playing out in the public square. Social media turned Miller into a symbol. Memes spread, some mocking his arrogance, others using his laugh as the chilling soundtrack to stories of bias. Derek's calm replies became rallying cries. Screenshots of his quiet expression when Miller dismissed his ID circulated with captions like "Dignity under fire." By evening, pressure forced the mayor to address the city. Standing at a podium inside City Hall, flanked by advisors, she faced a wall of cameras. Her voice carried both resolve and unease. "What we witnessed was unacceptable," she said. "This is not about titles. This is about the integrity of our institutions. A judge, a servant of the people, was mocked in public by someone sworn to uphold the law. That is not policing, that is arrogance, and this city will not stand for it." She promised an independent review, pledging transparency and accountability. Outside, protesters cheered, though many shouted that promises were not enough. At barbershops, diners, and church basements, the debate raged. Some argued Miller was just doing his job clumsily. Others saw no defense. One man put it plainly while sipping coffee at a corner cafe. "If you can't tell the difference between a loiterer and a judge after he shows you ID, maybe you shouldn't be wearing a badge." Law professors at local universities added their voices. In lectures streamed online, they framed the incident as a textbook example of bias. One professor declared, "Respect for the judiciary is not optional in a democracy." When a police officer laughs at a judge, he's not just mocking a man, he's mocking the law itself. Churches held vigils, synagogues and mosques issued statements of solidarity. Civil rights groups organized teach-ins, handing out flyers that read, "Bias isn't new, but now it's undeniable." While the uproar grew, Derek Coleman remained silent. He gave no interviews, made no public appearances outside his court duties. To some, it seemed strange. Why wouldn't he speak when the world demanded his voice? But to those who understood him, the silence was deliberate. He was letting the storm swell, letting truth gather force without the distraction of ego. Monique Brown, his longtime secretary, defended his restraint when asked by reporters. "Judge Coleman doesn't speak to be heard. He speaks to be understood. He will speak when the time is right." And so the anticipation built. Every chant outside the courthouse, every op-ed, every call to radio stations carried the same undertone. When will he speak? While Derek's dignity grew in silence, Miller's world shrank in noise. Suspended from duty, stripped of his badge and weapon, he sat in his small apartment watching the protests on television. The chants outside rattled his nerves. His phone buzzed endlessly. Calls from reporters, angry voicemails from strangers, even messages from old friends telling him to lay low. Once he had walked the precinct with a swagger, certain of his place. Now he was a pariah. Colleagues avoided him, neighbors whispered. His laugh, once a careless reflex, had become infamous. He muttered to himself, pacing his living room, "They're making me the villain. They're making me the example." But deep down, he knew he had given them the script. Across North Carolina, conversations shifted. Parents told children to watch the video, explaining why dignity mattered. Teachers used it as a civics lesson. Activists organized statewide rallies. Even lawmakers began to weigh in, some calling for reforms, others scrambling to distance themselves from the controversy. What had started as one smirk on courthouse steps had become a catalyst. A judge's calm silence against a cop's arrogant laugh had crystallized into something larger, a demand for change. The uproar wasn't fading, it was multiplying, building, deepening. Raleigh was no longer just a city of government and law. It had become the testing ground for dignity, accountability, and trust. And in the heart of it all stood Derek Coleman, quiet, steady, waiting. Racist cop laughs at security guard. He's the state court of appeals judge. For 2 long days after the confrontation, Derek Coleman said nothing. The courthouse steps still carried the echoes of chants, the plaza still held the memory of Miller's laughter, and the city was still buzzing with arguments in barber shops, living rooms, and corner cafes. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, holding handmade signs. Reporters stood in clusters, their microphones waiting for a statement that never came. Yet every morning Derek walked up the same marble steps, head high, posture calm, carrying his worn leather briefcase as if the outside storm didn't exist. Colleagues asked why he was silent. Students emailed him for comment. National outlets requested interviews. Still, he said nothing. His restraint baffled some and inspired others. To those who knew him best, it was familiar. Derek was never a man of quick outbursts or reactive words. He let silence do its work until the right moment arrived. By the 3rd evening, the city could wait no longer. The courthouse auditorium had been opened for a public forum, and word spread that Derek would finally speak. The crowd filled every seat, spilled into the aisles, and stood along the back walls. Hundreds more gathered outside, listening on portable speakers. News crews jostled for position, their lights glaring against the polished wood of the room. The anticipation was electric. Some expected fire and fury. Others thought he might call for Miller's resignation personally. Many simply wanted to hear his voice after days of calculated quiet. At precisely 7 o'clock, the side door opened and Derek walked in. He wore a simple navy suit with a white shirt and plain tie, avoiding the robe that had become a symbol of authority. He wanted to appear not as an institution, but as a man. He moved without haste, his eyes meeting those in the crowd with calm acknowledgement. He took his place at the podium, rested both hands on either side, and let the silence linger before speaking. When his voice came, it was steady, resonant, and heavy with meaning. 2 days ago, he began, I was laughed at on the steps of this courthouse, not because I broke a law, not because I posed a threat, but because of an assumption the audience hushed. His words carried clarity, free of anger, yet sharpened by truth. An officer of the law saw me standing outside the building where I have worked for years. He looked at me, ignored my identification, and mocked me as nothing more than a security guard. He dismissed me with laughter. That moment was not about who I am. It was about what he thought I wasn't. The statement drew a low murmur through the auditorium. Derek paused, giving the weight of his words room to settle before continuing. I stand here tonight not just as Judge Coleman. I stand as Derek Coleman, the son of a mill worker and a school teacher, the boy who grew up in Greensboro, the man who studied law because he believed justice should not depend on who you are or how you look. I have walked through neighborhoods where laughter was used as a weapon, where people were dismissed because they didn't fit expectations. I never imagined that one day, on the steps of my own courthouse, I would feel that same dismissal. Heads nodded across the room. Some in the crowd whispered to one another, recognizing the universality in his words. This incident is not about my pride, Derek continued. My dignity has never been defined by another man's words. This is about every person who has been laughed at, dismissed, or diminished because of bias. If a sitting judge can be mocked in broad daylight, imagine how many others suffer in silence, without cameras to capture it. Imagine the citizens who walk away from encounters humiliated, doubting themselves, convinced that their voice does not matter. He paused again. The silence wasn't empty. It was charged with the collective weight of experiences unspoken. I want to be clear, Derek said, his voice dropping lower. drawing the audience closer. I do not call for vengeance. I do not call for humiliation in return. What I call for is accountability, because bias in uniform is not a personal insult. It is a danger. It corrodes trust, it erodes dignity, and it undermines justice. And when trust is gone, the law itself collapses. Applause thundered across the room, rising like a wave. Derek raised his hand gently, and the crowd quieted again. This is not about one officer. It is about a culture where arrogance is mistaken for authority, a culture where laughter replaces judgment, a culture where bias is excused instead of confronted. That culture must change, not for me, but for every person who deserves to walk through this courthouse with dignity and tact. The words resonated deeply. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras clicked in rapid succession. Citizens leaned forward in their seats as if they were breathing the same truth. In my life, I have faced challenges far greater than mockery, Derek said. I have written opinions that shaped laws, presided over cases that decided lives, and shouldered the responsibility of justice with steady hands. But nothing unsettles me more than the idea that a citizen, any citizen, could be treated as invisible, unworthy, or laughable by those who wear a badge. His voice rose not in anger but in conviction. The law cannot stand if laughter is allowed to replace respect. The law cannot stand if arrogance is allowed to override duty. The law cannot stand if dignity is treated as optional. Applause broke out again, louder this time, people standing on their feet. Some clapped with tears in their eyes, others shouted words of support. Derek let the noise wash over the room before speaking once more, quieter, slower, every syllable deliberate. I have been asked why I waited to speak, why I did not rush to microphones, why I let the silence linger. I waited because I wanted the truth to breathe, because the moment I make this about me, it becomes small. And this is not small. This is about the trust between citizens and those who are sworn to protect them. That trust has been broken, and we must repair it, not with apologies, but with accountability. Reporters leaned forward, sensing history being written in real time. I ask you, the citizens of this state, to demand more. Demand more from your officers. Demand more from your leaders. Demand more from the very institutions sworn to uphold fairness. Justice is not an abstract idea. Justice is lived in every interaction, every stop, every laugh, every word spoken in authority. And justice cannot survive arrogance. The room shook with applause. People rose from their seats, clapping until their hands stung, some chanting his name. Yet Derek did not smile. His face remained calm, his expression steady. He hadn't come for cheers, he had come for clarity. I will end with this, Derek said, his voice soft but piercing. I am not here to claim victory. The dismissal I endured is not unique, and it is not finished. This is not my fight alone. This is our fight, and it will not end with a press conference or an investigation. It will end only when no citizen has to wonder if their dignity will be laughed at on the steps of their own courthouse. The final words hung in the air like a verdict. The audience erupted, many standing, some weeping, others chanting, "Justice, justice, justice." Outside, the chants spread down the block, where hundreds listened on speakers. The echo of voices rolled through the city, carrying Derek's words further than any single microphone could. As he stepped away from the podium, reporters shouted questions, but he did not answer. He walked steadily toward the exit, his hands relaxed at his sides. His colleagues fell in step behind him. Clerks hurried to keep pace, but Derek moved with the same calm rhythm he had carried up those courthouse steps every day of his career. Outside, the chants grew louder as the doors opened. People surged forward, trying to catch a glimpse. Phones lifted high, flashbulbs burst, but Derek kept his gaze forward. He did not wave. He did not grandstand. He simply walked, embodying the very message he had delivered. Dignity is not loud, but it is unshakable. And in that moment the city understood. His silence had been thunder. His words had been truth. His calm had been strength. And his message had become larger than any insult, larger than any laugh, larger than one man. It had become a movement. The fallout from Officer Scott Miller's mockery was not swift. It was relentless. What began as a single video clip, shared online, spread like wildfire across North Carolina and beyond, igniting conversations that had long simmered beneath the surface. Within hours of Judge Derek Coleman's speech, hashtags had climbed into national trending lists. News anchors debated it in primetime slots. Radio shows replayed Derek's words. Bias in uniform is not just an insult. It is a danger. They were repeated in classrooms, scrawled on protest signs, and quoted in opinion columns that demanded systemic reform. This wasn't just a Raleigh story anymore. It was a mirror held up to the country. Inside the Raleigh Police Department, Miller's name had become toxic. Colleagues who once traded jokes with him in the break room avoided eye contact. Younger officers whispered about how one laugh had ended his career. Internal affairs investigators combed through his record, and what they uncovered was damning. There were reports of dismissive language toward citizens during routine stops, complaints of unnecessary escalation, accusations that he belittled people when they asked legitimate questions about why they were being detained. Most had been dismissed for lack of evidence. Now, with the nation watching, each one was reopened. The final report was brutal, a documented pattern of arrogance, bias, and mockery. No single case had been explosive enough to spark change, but together they painted a picture of a man unfit to wear the badge. When the chief called Miller into his office for the last time, the officer's once confident smirk was gone. His voice cracked as he said, "So that's it?" 20 years down the drain because of one bad day, the chief's reply was cold but firm. Not one bad day. A bad pattern. The difference is that this time the world was watching. Miller surrendered his badge and service weapon. His uniform hung limp on his frame as he walked out of headquarters for the final time. Reporters swarmed, shouting questions, but he kept his head down, muttering only one phrase. "They made me a scapegoat." But the truth was clear. Miller hadn't been made into anything. He had shown the world who he was, and the world had refused to look away. For the Raleigh Police Department, the scandal was more than a personnel matter. It was a credibility crisis. Trust, once frayed, now threatened to snap completely. The police chief held a press conference on the courthouse steps, the very spot where Miller's smirk had set off the storm. Cameras clicked as he spoke, with uncharacteristic humility. "What happened here was unacceptable," he admitted. "No judge, no citizen, no person should be mocked or dismissed by someone sworn to protect them. Officer Miller's conduct does not reflect the values we claim to uphold. But we cannot pretend this is only about one officer. It is about a culture that allowed such arrogance to go unchecked. That ends today." Reporters pressed hard. Would other officers be investigated? Would leadership resign? The chief's jaw tightened, but his words carried weight. "Yes, every complaint filed in the past 5 years is being reopened. If we find patterns, we will act. This department cannot rebuild trust unless we confront our failures, no matter how painful." It was an extraordinary admission. For years, misconduct complaints had languished in files, rarely surfacing unless something catastrophic occurred. Now, with the glare of national scrutiny, the department was forced to acknowledge what citizens had long claimed, that arrogance wasn't isolated, it was systemic. At the state level, the ripple effect was unavoidable. The governor called an emergency press conference flanked by civil rights leaders, clergy, and law enforcement officials. "What we saw in Raleigh was not just disrespect to a man," she said firmly. "It was disrespect to the institution of justice itself. Judge Coleman's dignity cannot be diminished, but the fact that he was mocked, dismissed, and laughed at reveals a deeper wound in our system. We cannot allow arrogance in uniform to threaten the public trust." She announced the creation of an independent task force on policing standards, charged with investigating not only Miller's case, but statewide practices. Community leaders applauded. Critics muttered about political theater. But one thing was undeniable. The name Derek Coleman had become the catalyst for a movement. Meanwhile, the public wasn't waiting for official action. Citizens took to the streets. Marches swelled, not just in Raleigh, but in Durham, Charlotte, Fayetteville, and beyond. Some carried signs with Derek's silhouette sketched against courthouse steps. Others carried placards with his words, "Justice isn't a destination, it's a discipline." Chants echoed through downtown corridors. "Coleman, Coleman, Coleman. Bias in blue won't do." It wasn't anger alone that fueled the protests. It was pride. For many, Derek Coleman symbolized something long overdue. The quiet dignity of a man who refused to answer mockery with rage, but instead with truth so undeniable it shook an entire state. While the city burned with noise, Derek remained, as always, steady. He did not march with the protesters, nor did he appear on talk shows despite dozens of invitations. Chose instead to return to his chambers, to the quiet discipline of the law. Reporters begged for interviews. Commentators speculated about his silence. But those close to Derek knew it wasn't silence at all. It was patience. One evening, Monique Brown, his longtime secretary, asked softly, "Why don't you say more? People want to hear from you." Derek smiled faintly. "Because this isn't about me, Monique. The moment I make it personal, it shrinks. Let the truth speak louder than my pride. That's how real change happens." Those words spread quietly, carried by clerks and colleagues, and in their simplicity, they reinforced the very symbol Derek had become. Weeks later, Derek delivered an address at a law school symposium. The auditorium overflowed. Students packed the aisles, professors leaned forward eagerly, journalists lined the walls. He stood at the podium, his navy suit pressed, his voice steady. An officer's laughter may seem small, but it wasn't laughter at me, it was laughter at the idea that I belonged. If it can happen to a judge, it can happen to anyone. And if it can happen to anyone, then justice is in danger. That is why we must confront not just the act, but the culture that allowed it. He paused, letting the silence sharpen his words. Justice cannot survive arrogance. It cannot survive mockery. It survives only through discipline, humility, and accountability. And when those are absent, we all lose. The crowd erupted in applause. For young law students, it was a call to arms. For seasoned attorneys, it was a reminder of why they had chosen the profession. And for citizens watching online, it was validation that dignity could stand firm even when mocked. Scott Miller faded from the headlines, but not from consequence. He filed appeals, claiming wrongful termination, but each was swatted down by the weight of the internal investigation. His name became shorthand for arrogance in uniform. Training seminars used his footage as a warning of how quickly unchecked bias could destroy a career and a reputation. In the quiet of his apartment, Miller brooded. Once he had been the man who laughed first. Now he was the man remembered for a laugh that ended everything. Months later, Derek Coleman walked the courthouse steps again, the same steps where it all began. The plaza was quieter now. No cameras, no protests, no shouting crowds. just the hum of the city around him. As he paused, a young woman approached timidly, clutching a law textbook. Her voice trembled as she said, "Judge Coleman, because of you, I applied to law school. Because you showed me that dignity can't be laughed away." Derek's eyes softened. He placed a hand on the book and said quietly, "Remember this, the robe doesn't make the judge. The discipline does. Carry that and you'll serve justice well." She nodded, tears in her eyes. Derek turned and continued up the steps, his silhouette framed against the evening sky. His stride was calm, steady, unbroken, the very embodiment of what he had taught. Dignity rises, even when mocked. One man's arrogance had tried to reduce him to a punchline, but Derek Coleman transformed it into a movement. Officer Miller's laughter was supposed to belittle. Instead, it revealed. It revealed the fragility of arrogance, the resilience of dignity, and the unstoppable force of truth. And in the end, it wasn't the laughter that people remembered. It was the silence Derek held until the moment was right, and the thunder he spoke when the world needed to hear it. Because justice isn't loud, it isn't flashy, and it isn't always immediate. Justice is patient, justice is disciplined, and justice, when it finally arrives, speaks louder than any laugh.